Hey everyone, it's Brett here with the Tuning School, and on this Tech Tuesday, we are back with Tooley for our second interview. If you didn't catch that first one, make sure you go back and watch it because there's a lot of good information in there. Today we're going to be talking more about camshafts, selecting the right ones for your applications, and the different stages that Brian and his team actually have there at Tooley Racing. So let's get started. Brian, welcome back. Thank you so much for doing another video with us. We loved the first one. We're really excited to do another one with you today so we could talk more about your company, your products, and choosing the best camshaft for your application.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So at your company, all of your cams, or most of your cams, come in stages, usually 1 through 4. For the guys at home that are looking at buying cams specifically from y'all, can you explain exactly what those stages are and what applications they're best suited for?
You know, the stages obviously go pretty much from very mild to fairly wild. And when you look at the cam specs, you know, a lot of people know that the intake valve close is the most important event. And when you look at, let's say, like our LS1, LS2 cams, you know, those 4 stages, that intake valve close point is within 1 degree on all 4 stages. And so as the duration increases, intake and exhaust on those camshafts, we're simply increasing overlap and exhaust valve open event. And you know, the overlap on those 4 cams go from basically around -4 degrees to 5 degrees, then 10 degrees and 15 degrees. And you know, so the good thing is, you know, by 3,500 RPM or so, you know, each stage makes progressively more power. So as you work your way up from each stage, the engine basically makes more power from 3,500 RPM on up. A lot of people don't realize that. You know, they assume that more overlap kills mid-range torque, but it's just not true. It does kill low-speed torque, particularly in the, you know, the drivability area, you know, that 1,500 RPM to 2,000 RPM drivability area. That increased overlap certainly hurts torque there, and anytime you hurt torque in that area, you also hurt drivability, right? Because drivability is really about torque. But, you know, if a guy wants to make more power, then each stage he can do that, but then each stage requires progressively more torque converter solve, or if you've got a manual transmission, it's just going to be more aggravating to drive, or you're going to have to spend a lot more time tuning it.
Gotcha. So it sounds like when it comes to the stages, overlap is king. So what did the R&D process look like for those stages, and how did you guys do the development?
Yeah, well, the R&D process for each series actually varies. You know, there's one series of like the LSA cams where, you know, we did one for a shop and then did another one for the same shop. And, you know, so then some of the shops end up doing the testing for us, working with us. We're supplying them cams for free, and then they do the labor and dyno testing, and we all learn. The LS3 cams, we actually bought all of our competitors' cams, ground different durations, cams with exact same duration, just different exhaust lift, or exact same intake valve close and overlap, just change exhaust valve open event. And so I sent 18 LS3 cams to Richard Holdener at West Tech, and he tested those. The truck cams initially were things that we just, you know, we looked at the open close points, derived what we liked and wanted, and then took those to market. But then, you know, 6 months ago, you know, we thought, well, you know, let's revisit these things and actually change some overlaps and some center lines and see if we can make these things make a little bit better average torque, which we did. So then we launched the truck V2 cams, and those cams are also tested at West Tech. We sent Richard 12 or 14 cams that he tested for us there. But now that we have our own in-house engine dyno, obviously we won't have to farm that out anymore.
That's awesome. It sounds like you guys really do your homework and are putting in the work to make sure these cams are the best that they can be, and it's only going to get better with that dyno. So when a customer is looking to buy a camshaft from you or your team, what's the information they need to come to the table with in order to get the right cam for their setup?
Well, the intake manifold itself kind of dictates where the engine is going to make peak power. So we don't ask people too much about where they're trying to make peak power. The things that we ask them is it a daily driver? Is it automatic? Do you have a stall? How much power are you trying to make? And of course, the guys that are realistic, they're like, I daily drive this thing. I've got a 2,500 stall. I'm trying to make 400 horsepower with my LS1. Those are the simple guys, of course. The guys that have a 5.3 in a truck and they think they're going to make 500 rural horsepower and daily drive the thing with a stock torque converter, those are obviously the huge challenges, because the only way you're going to do all that is if you put a supercharger on top of the engine. You're just not going to do that naturally aspirated.
So it sounds like the converter is a big determining factor here in deciding really what stage you're going to go with. So at what stage do you suggest actually getting a converter?
And it really varies by application, because like the LSA cars, you can pretty much run any stage of our camshafts with a stock converter, but our largest stage 4 LSA cam has 5 degrees of overlap, right? But then when you get into, typically LS1, LS2, the LS3 cams, by the time you get to a stage 2, you almost need a converter, and by the time that you get to a stage 3, you definitely need a converter. So it just varies from genre to genre of what's needed. But even the truck cams are kind of the same thing. To stage 2, you can run a stock converter. Stage 3, stage 4, you need an aftermarket converter.
So do you have a suggestion on stall speed, or maybe aftermarket companies specifically that you guys like to use at BTR?
Yeah, there's so many great converter people out there. We use Circle D a lot. We use Yank a lot. We use PTC in some applications. Joe at Pro Torque in our competition level stuff. And a lot of times we will let the converter folks decide what the stall needs to be. We don't micromanage them too much on that. Chris Seahorn at Circle D, he contacted me several years ago, and he was just like, look, I'm really struggling with some of these converter stall speeds, because I'll do the same exact converter for this applications versus this, and there's huge differences in stall speed. And then we had quite an education on camshaft timing events, cylinder heads. I told him, I'm like, you can go from a small intake valve on a cylinder head to a big intake valve on a cylinder head, and at low RPMs, at 2,000, 2,500 RPM, you can lose 100 foot-pounds of torque between those two different intake valve diameters. And he didn't actually realize that at that time. So keeping all of those things in mind is what those guys need to do the job that they do.
So that's interesting about the intake valve scenario that you just gave. So what exactly is the reason that decrease in power is happening? Is it due to airflow velocity, or what exactly is going on?
No. Okay. At low speeds, that intake valve is your check valve. So when that piston, because that piston is a third of the way up before that intake valve even closes, right? The bigger an intake valve is, the more low lift flow you have, right? So as that piston is coming up, you want to trap that air. Well, if that valve is smaller, it has less low lift flow, so it's going to act as a check valve and trap that air sooner. If it has a big valve, it's got a lot of low lift flow, and it's just pushing that air back into the intake port until that valve finally closes.
Wow, well, even I just learned something, because that's a very interesting way of looking at it. That's very cool. Now, to circle back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, you mentioned LSA blowers a few times and that they didn't need converters as soon as other applications. What exactly is the reasoning for that?
Well, particularly a root style supercharger, everybody knows, they add torque from bottom to top, as opposed to a centrifugal supercharger. Obviously, a centrifugal supercharger, they typically lack mid-range torque, and we typically will crutch the camshaft to make more mid-range torque with the centrifugal supercharged cam, because as that centrifugal supercharger gains RPM, it always gains boost, so the engine's going to gain power. A positive displacement supercharger is just the opposite. It's making a ton of low-speed torque, and then as you gain RPM, it's typically losing power. So we actually have to crutch those camshafts for peak power rather than mid-range power like a centrifugal supercharged can. But the positive displacement superchargers, they make such great torque everywhere. Those things are making torque, practically off idle, and that torque reduction helps the drivability.
Gotcha. So where you may have lost some torque due to the cam profile at low RPMs, that blower is going to make right up for it. So that makes a lot of sense actually why that would be that way. Now, when it comes to selecting a camshaft for an application, what's the most common mistake you see people make?
It would be hard to say that the biggest mistake. One big mistake is people assume that more lift makes more power. Understand that anytime you go to more lift, you're hurting the dynamic stability of the camshaft, and therefore you're reducing the reliability of it. If you're daily driving something 15,000 miles a year, if you're going to run 30,000 miles before you change springs, you need a cam kit that's very reliable. And a lot of people call us and say, "Hey, I hear you guys have the most powerful cam kits," and I caution them. I'm like, "Well, we can make more power, but we actually sacrifice some power for durability." And it's very interesting because, we've lost dealer shops, to competitors that could make 10 real horsepower more power. And then after they fell some lifters, then they come back to us and they've kind of seen the light. You can't get something for nothing. And, so getting into camshafts that aren't very good dynamically is a big mistake. Obviously, see a lot of people simply using too big of a camshaft. If you give a guy 4 choices, he's going to go right for the biggest one. So obviously running too big a cam is probably the number one mistake. Very common. People hate their cars trying to daily drive with a stage 4 cam, and they put a stage 2 cam in it, and they're like, "Oh my God, this car's so much more fun to drive." And so those are the biggest mistakes that I see.
Gotcha. So what's the biggest mistake that you see people make when installing a camshaft?
The biggest mistake I see by far is either A, leaving the cam retaining plate off the front of the engine, B, failing to get it tight and it coming loose, and C, failing to get the timing chain gear bolts tight, properly torqued. And then even using subpar cheap dampers can actually vibrate those bolts out of the camshaft. Anything that allows that camshaft to start moving in that engine forward and back then allows a lifter to hit the lobe next to it. So then you get a bunch of lifter failures. So anytime somebody calls and says, if anybody that calls and says they feel more than one lifter, we know exactly what happened. That camshaft is no longer in the engine where it's supposed to be. It has physically moved because they've done something wrong. They've got something loose. And we've even seen guys that run the roller Torrington bearing timing chain gears forget to put the Torrington bearing on the back, and then that causes the camshaft to move in the engine just enough for a lobe to catch the lifter next to it and tear lifters up. I actually had a professional install shop in Texas do that. He said, "Hey, we just installed your cam kit and your lifters and fell 3 or 4 lifters." I'm like, "Well, clearly the install was done wrong. I hate to hurt your feelings, but something's wrong there." And nope, that we did nothing wrong. Okay, pull the engine out, send it to us, and then, we look down in the lifter hole and the lobe is that far off from where it should be. And you can put a screwdriver down in there and move the cam back and forth, with that retaining plate on the front of that engine, that cam only moves a few thousandths forward and aft. And if you do anything that allows that camshaft to move front to back, you're going to have a really bad day.
That's some scary stuff, so you're definitely going to want to pay attention when installing it to make sure that does not happen. Now, my next question is, if let's say you had a completely stock LS3 engine and you put a camshaft in it and that's all you had done, what's the next modification that's going to best benefit that camshaft in that application?
Well, the things that you should have done before you put the cam in, right? The cold air, the headers, the exhaust, you really need those parts first, so you can get everything that you should get out of the camshaft. If you've got stock cold air and certainly stock exhaust manifolds, you don't need a camshaft. You need to go buy headers, in my opinion.
That makes a lot of sense. So if you're sitting at home thinking about buying just a camshaft, you've heard it here first, go ahead and buy the other stuff before you go ahead and do that. Now, when it comes to tuning a vehicle, do you have very many people that think a cam does not need a tune for their application?
We see it some, and unfortunately that's something that all of my sales guys assume people know. And, they'll sell somebody a cam kit, and then the guy calls back and says, my car's not running right. And it's like, well, who tuned it? What do you mean, who tuned it? For us, it's almost like you know that you got to get dressed before you walk outside in the morning. The guys that don't know that they have to have their car tuned when they do a cam kit, that's a real problem. But then the other thing that we see is we see huge differences in the tuning ability among tuners and shops. I mean, we have guys that run our tiny stage 2 truck cam that's 212, 218 at 50, and they can't get the truck to idle. And it's just like, if you can't get the truck to idle with a stage 2 truck cam, you don't need to be tuning. You need to go to school. You need to do something else. You should not be tuning people's vehicles.
Yeah, we definitely see that on our sides of things as well, actually teaching people how to tune. I tell all my students that come to a hands-on class or that take the Learn at Home courses or even the online courses, I say anybody can wide open throttle tune. Park throttle fuel tuning is pretty easy as well, but idle tuning is the hardest thing you'll do, especially the more aggressive a camshaft gets. There's a lot of tables involved. You've got to know which ones to change, in which order, by how much, and then it changes a lot when you're talking about different generations of GM ECUs. So it's definitely one of the more harder things to do when it comes to tuning a GM vehicle. But if you don't know how to do that at home, you can simply reach out to us and we can get you sorted with it. So Brian, thank you for being with us again today. We appreciate your time and look forward to speaking to you again as soon as possible.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks again for having me.
I hope you guys enjoyed this series of videos and that you know way more about camshafts leaving them than you did coming in. If you guys want to see more technical videos or more guest interviews, make sure you leave some comments below and let us know who you want us to interview next. Like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media, and as always, stay tuned.